let's begin today. I'm ready to have to host one of my old friend, Dr. Şahan Savaş Karataşli. He's received his PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins University, where he also worked as a researcher at the Arrighi Center for the Global Studies. Subsequently, he served as a research fellow at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, and he is now a global and comparative historical sociologist at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He examines mostly the dynamics of historical capitalism and social and global inequalities, social movements, labor, and nationalism through a global, long historical perspective. And he also received many awards in this regards. Also, he serves as a chair of political economy of the World Systems section of the ASA and as editor of the Marxist Sociology blog. Now, today he's going to present us one of his latest research topics, how genocide, ethnic violence, and war shape the foundations of capitalism and nationalism. Thank you, Savaş, for joining us. And again, I'm so sorry for the technical problem. Okay, Savaş, you have 45 minutes and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me well? And can you see the screen right now?
Yes, we can hear you very well and we can see the screen.
Okay, excellent. So it's great honor to be here today, first of all. So I'd like to thank Center for the Study of the Social and Global Justice, and especially Sinem and Oliver for their kind invitation. So the title of my talk is How Genocide, Ethnic Violence, and War Shape the Foundations of Capitalism and Nationalism. And for this talk, I didn't prepare a full-fledged presentation. This is a theme that is emerging in the book manuscript that I'm trying to finish right now. I'm working on a book manuscript that examines the historical coevolution of capitalism and nationalism from a world systems perspective, starting from 14th century to present. It's called Global Waves of Nationalism. But when I was working on that book, I was struck by this one theme that I'd like to explain and talk about today. So instead of a full-fledged presentation, I put some pictures and paintings, and at the title, I put this painting on the left by François Dubois, Le Massacre de la Saint-Barthélemy, so the Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and I will be talking about this particular case too. But overall, what I want to do today in this talk is to explain that the violent episodes of history, such as genocides, ethnic violence, and wars, are not aberrations from the way our modern world functions, but they are foundational to capitalism and nationalism. And put differently, I want to suggest that these forms of organized violence were not accidental side effects or accidents that happened in history, but they have been structural, constitutive, and in many cases systematically deployed to build to jumpstart and build capitalist economies and national identities. So, and some of these arguments, I'm looking at the audience right now. There are lots of experts, colleagues, and friends, and I recognize. So some of these themes will not be foreign to you, but some of them might be. So the part that is actually more familiar to people will be the idea of primitive accumulation from Das Kapital by Karl Marx. Now, in Karl Marx, in his critique of political economy, he actually tried to explain that the foundations of capitalism has always been marked by violence and coercion. So that was the term, he was using the term primitive accumulation to explain how these processes came to being. Primitive accumulation, or original accumulation, as the political economists used to say, is not a term invented by Marx, but Adam Smith and many before them were kind of using the term to explain how does capitalist relations start? Because for capitalism to operate, you need to have people with some capital, some money, and people who that should be free labor, who must be trying to sell their labor power to work. And capitalism always assumes that like some people saved money, became hard, they became with their own work, they became capitalists by saving, and then those who didn't do, they became workers, and that's how the capitalist relations start. But Marx was in the later sections of Das Kapital, at the end, he says that, look, actually, this is not how it happened, because first, there is a process called primitive accumulation, which happened very differently from these political economists are explaining to you. Primitive accumulation is not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but its starting point. And this is where conquest, slavery, robbery, murder were not anomalies, but they were actually the rule of how these starting points emerged. And for Marx, the dispossession of people from their land, the theft of the common resources, and violent construction of new property relations were written in history in the letters of fire and blood. That's what he used to say. And he usually examines the classical case of England to explain how this works out. But he also says that the different moments of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. And in England, at the end of the 17th century, they arrived at a systematical combination. So what he's trying to say is that although in Capital, he looked at the case of England as the classical case of primitive accumulation, how coercion and violence jump-started these capitalist relations. But actually, the first experiences, the first examples occurred in Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. So there are some historical cases, and they do not necessarily follow the English path. There are very much differences between how primitive accumulation took place in these cases. Now, and also in this chapter, he also talks about, there is a longer quotation that I didn't put here because it was kind of tangential to the argument that I'm planning to make here. But he also tries to explain how some of these moments of primitive accumulation were linked to each other through financial flows. There's a paragraph in Capital where he says, well, the primitive accumulation in Holland emerged due to the financial flows coming from the declining Italian city-states. And then when Holland was in decline, they gave lots of loans to England, and they started the primitive accumulation in England. And when England was in decline, and he's writing in 1860s, and he says the same process is happening right now in front of our eyes in the United States. Okay, so there's a relationship between some of these financial flows from the declining centers, creating primitive accumulation in new locations, which for him is always written in the letters of fire and blood. So this is quite interesting because when I started working on the history of nationalism in world history, so I also realized that all of these moments that Marx was talking about are not only the starting points of capitalism in those countries and capitalism in a broad sense, but also they are the starting points of nationalism in these countries. So that's why primitive accumulation seemed to have an interesting counterpart, and that's why I started to envision this as a process of primitive unification. So what is this primitive unification? So just as primitive accumulation creates the material conditions for capitalism by violently dividing and producing classes like proletarians and capitalists, or for the capital and labor, primitive unification does the same for nationalism. It's the violent process by which a dominant state or an aspiring, rising state elites, they forge a nation out of they forge a nation by eliminating, excluding, subordinating other cultural, religious, ethno-linguistic groups within its territory. So it produces oppressing or oppressed nations, or what we can call the ruling nations and subject nations, or in a more broader term, the dominant cultural groups versus excluded minority populations. So in a way, the methods that were used in both processes were very similar. And I will explain some of these cases right now. It's always you see wars, conquests, maybe a colonial dynamic, slavery. There are genocides, but also not only the methods were similar. In many cases, the primitive accumulation and the primitive unification processes actually were the same thing, just the flip side of the same issue, and which is interesting because if that's true, there is a much closer relationship between these dual forces of modernity, capitalism and nationalism, as we understand it. So just to clarify, because like capitalism has many definitions, nationalism also has many definitions. And every time that I talk about nationalism, I'm operating in a modernist framework. So I don't believe that nations are primordial entities that have existed from the beginning of time or antiquity to today. They are modern entities. But I believe that the forces that we associate with modernity are not as recent as we imagine them. And just as capitalism, I view nationalism as a contradictory process. Actually, it's a very dialectical process. There are two different forms of nationalism that we can talk about. One of them, and that's what I'm focusing right now today, mostly, is called state-led nationalism. And it's a process whereby states produce a nation for themselves to accumulate more state power. So I explain this like the S and S prime dynamic. So states produce new nations for themselves to accumulate more power. So Fichte, a German theorist of nationalism, he says that in his words, like he says that nationalism is about accumulation of surplus power. So this is you can compare with the notion of surplus value. Accumulation is the key for capitalism. This is about surplus power. What's surplus power? You need to find a way to mobilize people in a given territory, regardless of, I mean, this can take many different forms. It can be ethnic, linguistic, religious. It can take, and it can change over time. But you mobilize these people not only with coercion, but also with consent. But you do it in a way that these people, they associate their particularistic interests with the general interest of the state and the state elites. So and that's the kind of the state-led nationalist dynamic that I'm talking about today. So let me explain a couple of things about how this process works. So before I do, this notion of primitive accumulation, although I'm trying to put it in a theoretical framework, but I'm not the first one who realized that nationalism was marked by violence and exclusion. So we are often told that nations are like imagined communities. They are constructed by invented traditions, they are often forged by shared values, maybe common languages or popular consent. But in reality, most state-led nations, emerged through shared exclusions. So wars, ethnic cleansing, genocides, cultural destructions are not barriers to national unity, as most political scientists today assume, but it's in this very foundation. And actually, historically, the two works that most explicitly talk about this is the Ernst Renan, Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? So what's the nation? And actually another Marx, Anthony Marx, with his work Faith in Nation, Exclusionary Origins of Nationalism, that I will briefly talk about too. So, but I want to do, instead of explaining this, how it is happening elsewhere, I want to go over the primitive accumulation moments that Marx talked about in Capital. There's different moments from Spain to Holland to France to England and to USA. And I want to explain how these dual tendencies of primitive accumulation and primitive unification played out. And then I would like to discuss more contemporary cases and why this framework is important to understand our current moment. So first, for Marx, interestingly, he says the first moment of primitive accumulation happened in Spain. And in Spain, there's an interesting magical moment of 1492. In 1492, lots of things happened in Spain. One is the Columbus voyage to what he calls the West Indies, and then they did what we call today the quote unquote the discovery of the Americas. And the year 1492 is also the completion of Reconquista. So it's the Iberian, the unification of the Iberian Peninsula and the expulsion of the kind of beginning of the expansion of the Moors and the Muslims, and Alhambra Decree, which is the expulsion of Jews that I will talk about in a bit. But for Marx, the moment of this discovery, the 1492 moment, is very critical because both Karl Marx and Adam Smith also, they see this as a turning point in world history. And in Capital, I will just read one quotation. He says, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and the entombment in mines of the indigenous population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, sign out the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. Now, two things are happening here, and Marx is primarily talking about what's happening in the American continent, because with the discovery of the America, which both for Smith and Marx and many other people are the beginning of this emergence of a capitalist world market, it also, quote unquote, coincides with one of the biggest genocides in the world's history, the genocides of the indigenous populations. And in the audience, I saw James Fenelon here, and he's one of the, I think, best experts on the subject of, and we have other experts here too. But what's interesting is the beginnings, what Marx and others call as the beginnings of the capitalist relations, emerged by not only the violent oppression of the indigenous people, and also they were sent to work in mines. And like the Potosi mines, and then to extract silver and other precious metals. And this was a big moment that Marx is talking about. But while this is happening in the American continent, a similar process is happening within the Iberian Peninsula, which is actually not that much discussed. Because what's happening, this is a time of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs. And their marriage in the 1460s, it kind of started the beginning of the unification of the different kingdoms. But what's interesting is today we cannot talk about nationalism in the way we understand it in the case of Spain. There was no Spain at the time. There were all these conglomerate of kingdoms, like Kingdom of Castilla and Leon. There was like Aragon, Valencia. These are all different kind of kingdoms. There is like, these are conglomerate of different kingdoms. But what Ferdinand and Isabella did is they found a way to mobilize these different kingdoms and the populations within these kingdoms for a common mission centered around the new emerging state, let's say this emerging Spanish state. And this mission was a religious mission. It was, they saw themselves as the defender of Catholicism and protector of Catholicism, but this was not the Catholicism of the papacy, because they were also kind of, quote unquote, indirectly rebelling against Pope in Italy, because they wanted to assert their sovereignty towards them. So they were nationalizing the Catholic Church properties too, and religious military orders, they were nationalizing them. But they were also, they started with the Alhambra Decree, for example, they started the expulsion of the Jews, and many conversos who they were suspicious of not converting to, or they converted to Christianity, but they were suspicious of practicing their faith in secret. They were being burned at stake. And the one of the interesting things is the only national institution at the time, it was the Catholic Inquisition, Holy Inquisition. That was what united all of these different kingdoms together. And there was this kind of really a religious mobilization of people. And people, this is a spectacle. This is from an haute de fait event. So, and people were supposed to be watching these events. And actually, people were asked to tell to the authorities if they see any converso, any Jew like practicing in secret. And then later on, this is also applied to Muslims. Like Muslims were also expelled from the Spanish territories. So, and what's interesting is many scholars and many historians, they say if we are to find the beginnings of the proto-national identity in Spain, it's at this moment. And what is interesting is this kind of this religious moment that we see in Spain, and this moment is kind of the similar things happening in the American continent. Like there's the internal and external dimensions of the same things, because in a way, what they are doing in Americas is there's reconquista happening in a foreign land. I'm sorry, did I miss the? Here we go. Okay, so I'll come back to this. But then the next example Marx says is the Dutch Republic and the 80, and then he's looking at, if you look at the Marx's writings about the beginnings of primitive accumulation in Dutch Republic, he talks about the beginnings in terms of the 8 Years' War from 1568 to 1648. And Dutch Republic was it was before a part of Spain, and they were speaking another language, but they were also Protestants, and they became Calvinists. And during this War of Independence, they started rebelling against Spain. And in the meantime, what they were doing is they inverted what the Catholic monarchs they have already been doing. So many of these Protestant revolts at the time, it's not happening in only Dutch Republic, it's happening, it's a Europe-wide phenomenon at this time. But because we are looking at the Dutch Republic right now, I'm talking about the Dutch Republic. But what they did is they started confiscating the Catholic church properties and the wealth of and their wealth, their properties. And this also started a dispossession process. Like people were actually freed from the land in capitalist terms. And this is the moment of the beginnings of the primitive accumulation in these lands. It's very interesting because there are, for example, Max Weber has a theory about he calls the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and he believes that how like Protestant work ethic started capitalism in Europe. But if you look, even if you accept the argument is wrong, because capitalism, you can argue, that existed before in a different way, as Marx is suggesting. And it was not Protestant, it was Catholic. But even if you look at the Protestant cases, what probably caused this rise of capitalism in these regions were not the Protestant work ethic per se, but this kind of violent, the coercive appropriation of the Catholics' properties. So that's kind of interesting. And what's interesting is at the same time while this is happening, before this, you cannot really talk about a Dutch national identity, because this will become what we call as the United Provinces. There are all these different provinces which are like operating like city-states, and they don't have a common identity among themselves. But then in the course of this fight and with this new mission, the Calvinist mission, this is the first time they start acquiring this kind of Dutch national identity, which actually many scholars such as Gorski and others have reflected upon and called the first case of nationalism according to their perspectives. Now, While this is happening, a similar thing is happening in France. This is the Karl Marx, the third moment of primitive accumulation that he explains. And we see in France what's happening. These are the French wars of religion. These three examples are that I have given are all about religion so far. But this is important, these wars of religion, because actually I mentioned Ernst Renan, his 1882 pamphlet, So What is a Nation? And here he is aware of how these violent wars and like these violence is actually how it played a key role in constructing the French national identity. He says, and I'm quoting him, forgetting, and I would even say historical error, are an essential factor in the creation of a nation, and thus the progress of historical studies is often a danger for nationality. Historical inquiry begins to light deeds of violence which took place at the origin of all political formations, even those whose consequences have been most beneficial. Unity is always brutally established. The modern nation is a result of a long past efforts of sacrifices and devotions, but it's also the outcome of what I might call forgetfulness, and I would even add historical error. The essence of a nation is that all individuals have many things in common, and also they have forgotten many things. No French citizen knows whether he's a Burgundian, an Allan, or a Visigoth. Every French citizen must have forgotten the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre. So what is this massacre? This massacre is like French is Catholic, and they're massacring Huguenots, so which are the Calvinists, and it's a huge massacre. And it's not one episode, this one violent episode, but this took 4 decades, similar events. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, in the 19th century and the 20th century, many scholars of nationalism who wanted to reflect upon the evolution of nationalism, they came with this idea that looking from the late 19th century and early 20th century, they say, well, there are 2 forms of nationalism. One is what we might call a Western nationalism, a civic nationalism, where it's inclusive, like people come together around a common state. And then there's this Eastern form of nationalism, which is exclusionary, ethnic, oriented, etc. But actually, this perspective is completely wrong if you have a longer historical perspective, because all of these quote unquote inclusive Western nationalisms, they had these exclusionary violent processes earlier. So that's why when they came to the 19th century, after like French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and aftermath, they were able to create this kind of inclusive sentiments if they ever existed. Even then, the similar episodes continued. So many scholars have been like pointing out to this exclusionary origins of the French nation that finds its first moment in these French wars of religion. What's also interesting is the same processes through the loothings of the Huguenots' properties, the wealth, and etc., as Heinrich Miller demonstrates, it's also the first time that you can see the rise of a French bourgeoisie. It's just the beginnings of that process, because this is the first time you can see a Catholic middle classes are emerging as the Huguenot middle classes are decreasing. So this is also these French wars of religion is also the change in those kind of relations, which will further accumulate their money in the course of this like 17th and 18th century, and then it will play a role in the French Revolution and etc. So the next moment, oops, where is the, okay, and the next moment in the Marxist explanation of primitive accumulation is the classical case of England, and this is the case that Marx explains in most details about how primitive accumulation works, and he mostly talks about enclosures and how the peasantry was freed from the land, and because the landowners now they wanted to create some space for the sheep, and then the people were kicked off from the land. But also Marx explains this has a lot to do with the confiscation of the church like properties, and then again the monasteries were freed, and then people were kicked out of their land, etc. And what's also interesting is the same process. If you look, it starts with both nationalism. The history of nationalism and capitalism in England starts from the era of the Tudors, and it's the same process you can see from the Protestantism onwards, but also they came to a peak during the English Civil War. And a good example of how primitive accumulation and primitive unification works out, you can see the case of Ireland, what's happening in Ireland, because this is the, on the right, you can see the Cromwell's colonization of Ireland. And this is interesting because, Ireland was subjugated into its agrarian position. And this continued throughout the Industrial Revolution too. So it was a typical case. And Marx is explaining a lot about how the initial property, wealth, and not only the resources, but also the necessity of the laborers, etc. They were emerging throughout this period through this colonization, but also the same process contributed to the emergence of a very bizarre, not bizarre, quote unquote, a new, unique national identity called the British national identity. Because in Britain, in the case of England, it's very complex because you have the English nationalism, you can talk about it, but then you have the Scottish, Welsh, etc. But there's this notion of Britishness, British nationalism. And the beginnings of the British national identity, kicks off after this process. And one of the interesting examples is in these overlapping spheres of nationhood, like English nationalism, you can find something like that. You can find British nationalism, but there is no equivalent of United Kingdomish nationalism. So when you include Ireland in, it doesn't make up the whole national framework because it has been kind of subjugated and excluded from this national processes, which also continued through the Industrial Revolution too. As Krishan Kumar, for example, he explains how Industrial Revolution forged the national identity between the English, Scottish, Welsh, etc. under the Britishness, but Ireland was not the case. So the story is much more complex than this, but also I have to explain in the British case one more interesting thing, because in Marx, the same processes that creates dispossession and proletarianization, which frees people from their land, it also plays a role in nationalism, because for nationalism to emerge, as like Ernst Gellner and many other theorists of nationalism say, you need to have people also detached, like there must be some groups who are free and mobile. There should be a certain level of social entropy, and then this must be contained in a territorial framework. So the social entropy means like people must be free to be able to move around this new emerging state and nation. Otherwise, if they are just stuck in their provinces and they're unable to move, it's very difficult to have this national imagination or the feeling of nation in that sense. I will finish now, with explaining the U.S. case, and then I will come back to why this matters. In the U.S. case, the last moment for Marx, he was writing in 1860s. That's why he was talking about this case. He talks about we can see that the United States is the last moment of the primitive accumulation in Marx's model. But when we look at the history of the United States, we can see that it has different moments in itself. The first started within the settler colonial dynamics in North America. And this happened this process was characterized by the violent dispossession of indigenous populations and mass enslavement of Africans. And partially, these were actually linked to each other in the case of the United States, because one of the reasons why lots of Africans were transported to and brought to Americas was due to pandemic, not pandemic, but not only that the indigenous populations, they were brutally murdered and excluded and subjugated, but they also part of the play was plague. That's what also the Western chronicles say, due to these diseases that white people were immune to, but the indigenous populations, they were not, they say, and they all died. That's why they couldn't they couldn't be made to work on plantation farms. There was a shortage of labor, which was quote unquote compensated by kidnapping and bringing lots of enslaved Africans to Americas. And in this period, these people in America, there's no American national identity. They see themselves as British. They have their colonial feelings, and they are pride members of the British colony. But then over time, through their fights against the indigenous populations, on the one hand, the indigenous people, they wanted to get their lands back, and also through the slave revolts, over time they create this a national identity around whiteness, and including the many whites, they were able to become part of this emergent nations. And it was characterized by the exclusion of these enslaved Africans and indigenous population. There were a couple of interesting periods in the US history where this was challenged, like the Bacon's Rebellion was one of them, where people, the settlers, colonials were complaining that they are not the British Crown did not protect them against indigenous populations, because the British Crown at the time, they had too many things happening at the same time. So they wanted to have some fur trade relationships with the indigenous people. So they were making peace. But the settler colonialists, they didn't like this, because they wanted to go and conquer new indigenous people's areas. They needed new lands, but the British Crown was stopping them. So, and then they organized a huge attack against the governor in Virginia, Berkeley, and then at that time, the blacks and the lower class whites and the white settlers, they fought together against this governor, saying that you are betraying us. Now, but seeing the danger after that, the British, they after suppressing this revolt, they really institutionalized racism in these territories, and then they institutionalize it by really boosting the white class, like white privilege and supremacy, which is actually it continued throughout. There's a second moment of primitive accumulation in Marx's account in Capital. That's why he was writing in 1860s. That's why he's saying right now the same process is taking place in America right now. And this is interesting because he is referring to the Civil War between the North and the South. And South is plantation economy working with slavery. The North is industrializing, but the North also needs free labor, so they want to emancipate slaves, etc. So, and the Civil War had a dual function. On the one hand, it turned United States into a more coherent, singular nation. Before that, people were talking as United States are, and it became United States is. And many political scientists, when they find out their turning point for the establishment of the US nation, they choose the US Civil War as the turning point to the starting point of the US nation. And at the same time, this process it transformed the enslaved labor into wage labor. But in a way, the promises of racial equality were never satisfied. I mean, although the slaves were emancipated, racial equality was not provided, especially the white solidarity against the enslaved now freed, but the black non-white populations. It maintained through the post-Reconstruction period. So, and this continues to produce and reproduce through the lynchings and through the Jim Crow laws, and it still continues in various different ways. So, but this was a big moment, and now I'm not going to further go into the U.S. case, but also there's a complication here between the northern nations and the southern nation in the United States, because this also corresponds to the emergence of what some scholars say as a southern nation in the United States. So, but these were the cases that Marx talks about. And while I was revisiting them and thinking about the historical coevolution of nationalism and capitalism, and maybe now I can stop sharing this and I can just talk like this, I also realized that this is not happening only in these locations. So there are many cases in which, when we talk about the primitive unification process, it's the same with the primitive accumulation process in the country. For example, in my country, I was born and raised in Turkey. So, and then when we talk about when is the primitive accumulation process of the Turkish nation, when did the Turkish bourgeoisie emerge? You need to look at the late Ottoman era, because during the Ottoman Empire, for example, there is no Turkish bourgeoisie, there is no Muslim bourgeoisie. Like the bourgeoisie, the merchant traders and anything that is the petty bourgeois and the bourgeois elements, they were all non-Muslims. The Greeks, the Armenians, the Jews, etc. But really the emergence of the Turkish bourgeoisie coincides with the era that what we call today as the Armenian genocide. It's the emergence of the post-1908 moment, and the CUP, the Committee for Unity and Progress, emerges under the idea of Turkishness. And then this is the beginning of the not only the expulsion of the Armenians and the mass killing of them, but also in a way, this is also the moment in which their properties are confiscated, the land is confiscated, and this actually creates the first time what would be the state-sponsored Turkish bourgeoisie, like the Sabancı family, etc. They all emerge within those periods, like in Adana, Çukurova region, etc., where these violences took place. And this is also the moment. It's the first time you see what is this kind of a Turkish Muslim identity is emerging and is kind of asserting itself. During the Ottoman era, for example, you don't have such a Turkish ideology or Turkish identity. You don't have it, and it only started. I mean, you have in the mid-19th century, you have something called Ottomanism beginning. It doesn't work. During the Abdülhamid's second era, there is something called Islamism. It doesn't work. But Turkism is a product of the this 1908 moment. It's there, and it coincides with this with these violent beginnings. So why is this important? So one, this kind of a framework tells us that it's not coincidental why and how nationalism and capitalism emerged as two forces of modernity. In many cases, they emerge as the two sides of the same process. So in a way, what created the capital and labor and create the distinction, it also created some forms of ruling nations or subject nations, ruling groups and the subject groups, and it created a link for domination, a process of domination in that sense. But also, in the primitive accumulation debate, there's a continuous debate around whether or not primitive accumulation is a singular event that happened once and disappeared, or whether it is continuous. It continues and it replicates itself, like David Harvey's concept of accumulation by dispossession. It says, well, it happens regularly. It happens, it's a continuous process. It's a cyclical process. And especially during crisis, capitalists, they start to gain profits by dispossession and forceful appropriation of people's money, wealth, resources, etc., etc. The same thing can be told with regard to primitive unification processes, because when a national identity is challenged, and this is usually challenged by different forms of social mobilizations from below, if it challenges that power relationship, then the ruling groups, they need to assert their identity or transform a new identity through these new manifestations of violence. And they need to mobilize people against these other groups, minority groups, to reassert their domination and superiority. And I will stop right now so that we have some time for discussion. But I believe that this dynamic has a lot to do with why we see this double process of accumulation by dispossession and this kind of violence against different groups in our times today. Because I think there is a very close relationship between these two moments. And maybe I should stop right now so that we can turn this into a conversation. Thank you very much.